The Willbreakers are a chapter of Space Marines based in the northern Segmentum Pacificus. The chapter has undergone a period of rebuilding after their chapter world was devastated by an Emperor's Children warband after the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum. The chapter employs a larger amount of long-range weaponry than most chapters and prefers not to engage in close-quarters combat until the very last hours of the battle. What little close combat weaponry the chapter possesses is highly valued among its members. To be granted a free choice of a weapon from the chapter armory is a great honor and a sign that a Marine has truly earned his place of trust in the chapter. The las cannon is the favored weapon for any vehicle or infantry unit that cannot mount a whirlwind launcher or similar artillery weapon and is prevalent throughout the vehicles and infantry of the chapter. The first company alone has over 30 las cannons ready to bring to bear when fully deployed. The Willbreakers thrive on large-scale warfare. Their captains are trained to think not of singular engagements, but of the wider conflict and every possible effect that an order might have. Down to the smallest level, every action a commander of this chapter takes is thought out and considered. Even the deployment of orbital defenses on their homeworld is meticulously planned and coordinated. When assaulting from orbit, it is a rare occasion that a Willbreaker's attack will not be preceded by a blistering orbital bombardment. As their name suggests, the Willbreakers specialize in causing so much damage even before the first Marines step onto the field that the enemy is broken, battered, and on his knees. After a strong beachhead has been established, the Marines will choose the nearest tactical position and isolate it, cutting off all contact with any of its other forces, surgically annihilating farms, mines and factories to turn what would be a near impenetrable fortress into a burning heap, filled not with fine warriors, but soldiers that have been starved and subjected to constant bombardment. It is then that the chapter will deploy its large amount of heavy weapon squads and deep strike capable units to smash through the weakened enemy forces with ease and lay waste to what was once a valuable strategic asset. When charging into battle, the Willbreakers will play their unique battle hymns over the external vox of their vehicles. When fighting against more numerous enemies, as the Willbreakers often have, the captains will pick out key positions in the battlefield and turn any desired area into a slaughter ground. The heavy tanks and dreadnoughts will form an impenetrable gun line, and no weapon will be silent as the enemies beat themselves to dust against a wall of ceramite and bolter rounds. Many an enemy commander has deployed his forces en masse, sure of a quick victory, only to be driven back as devastator squads and predator annihilators surgically annihilate the heavier elements of their army, leaving infantry squads to be mopped up by Inceptor units armed with assault bolters. One of the most highly prized tactics in a Willbreaker's captain's mental arsenal is the so-called horseshoe maneuver. The captain deploys his forces in a horseshoe formation, drawing the enemy in between two columns of infantry squads, supported by dreadnoughts and assault units equipped with jump packs, which remain hidden among terrain or buildings, while the curve of the shoe is made up of heavy tanks, Centurion Devastators and Terminator squads. Once the entire force is encircled, the two sides charge in. The enemy is caught in between a hammer and an anvil. If the enemy commander attempts to pull his forces back, he finds them blocked by Storm Talon gunships and targeted artillery strikes. Using this tactic, a vastly superior force can find themselves picked apart as the Astartes catch them in an inescapable net of gunfire. When not facing the enemy in an advance, but in a dire defense, this chapter will use quickly moving land speeder storms to ensure they are always kept apprised of the enemy position. The Willbreakers will use the environment to their advantage, positioning Devastator and sniper teams on buildings or, if need be, on faraway hills. One of the most prized defensive tactics is that wall of iron, whereby a captain will micromanage his tanks to form a blockade that funnels the enemy into a single street or corridor. At the far end of the approach, Terminator squads and dreadnoughts form a firing line that can cut down infantry and armored war engines alike. In this way, a captain can cripple an enemy before they even reach any fortress or position the Imperium is keen to protect. When establishing a fortress, the Willbreakers will try to place it with flat land on as many sides as possible, which makes any charging enemy vulnerable to the artillery, las cannons and heavy bolter volleys of the defenders. Should an enemy be skilled enough to break through the wall of iron or horseshoe tactics, the Willbreakers will mobilize wings of Stormhawk bombers to obliterate that area with missiles and allow the Willbreakers to move reserve troops into position around the breach to re-establish the maneuver. In the rare occasion that an attacking or defending division is forced into retreat, they will only retreat slowly and while firing all the way. In the most dire situations, a reserve strike force of 15 Terminator-plated Astartes is kept in orbit, ready to deploy at a moment's notice through a precisely coordinated teleport strike. This teleport puts them in between their enemy and the retreating Marines, forming a wall of ceramite and unleashing a blistering wave of stormbolter, assault cannon and heavy flame of fire. Using this tactic, a costly retreat can be turned into a situation perfect for a rapid counterattack. Captains of the chapter loathe to abandon a position entirely, and unless the threat of utter annihilation is looming on the horizon, they will only retreat as far as it takes to establish a new base of attack. The Willbreakers' attitudes surrounding civilians have been described as wasteful by some and heartlessly cruel by others. It is not uncommon for any civilians that happen to be in the way of one of the chapter's crushing advances to find their houses, businesses and farms turned into giant battlegrounds and rubble. Woe betide any civilian who gets in the way of a retreat. They are lucky if they are crushed. Should a civilian dare to attempt to stop the Marines, well, their fate is best left to the Emperor's vision, and his alone. During siege operations, it is not uncommon for the artillery batteries of the chapter to fall on the heads of captive civilians. Despite the apathetic approach to civilian casualties, the chapter abhors the actions of those who deliberately target human civilians, such as the Flesh Tearers, whose actions during the Third War of Armageddon have earned them a permanent spot at the Willbreakers' most distrusted allies. If the Willbreakers are apathetic towards the citizens of the Imperium, then they are nothing short of violently genocidal towards citizens of Rebel, Chaos or Xenoplanets. During battle, any civilians of an enemy planet will be killed on sight and treated with the same regard that enemy soldiers are. The Willbreakers have no mercy for traitors, heretics or Xenos, be they military or civilian. The Astartes will prioritize military targets, but once a city is technically secured, they will often perform brutal genocides, leaving the area in question devoid of any life save pure humans. This was seen prominently in the Willbreakers' Eastern Fringe campaign, where the Willbreakers performed a complete xenocide upon the Tau mining planet of Sethmis IV, leaving the planet devoid of sentient life. This action has been repeated many times throughout the chapter's history on all the races that Imperium calls enemy. A large portion of the Willbreaker strategy is based around psychological warfare. During offensive siege operations, the chapter artillery commanders use a sequential firing method that allows them to keep up a constant bombardment. This has a noticeable effect on the morale of the enemy troops, due to the lack of sleep from the constant ear-splitting explosions and the fear that any moment the artillery shell that will bring their doom may descend upon their head. In close and mid-range engagement, the chapter will attempt to deploy at least one squad of Primaris aggressors, equipped with Flamestorm gauntlets, both for their anti-infantry capability and the devastating effect on a warrior's will to fight their flame weapons can have. The Willbreakers use targeted destruction of buildings to force an enemy that is defending a heavily urban area into a small and compact area. the Astartes can use their mastery of heavy weapons to precisely target supply storage and medical facilities, depriving defenders of their basic necessities. The Willbreakers will be reluctant to expose themselves to enemy fire to prevent the enemy from felling any of their number, reinforcing their feelings of helplessness. The Willbreakers regard the Codex Astartes as an exceptional work of tactical genius and battlefield wisdom, and a great boon to whoever conducts their wars by it. However, the chapter will not hesitate to create entirely new command and military structures outside of the Codex. They keep to the 1,000 marine limit, but the function of their companies and traditions sometimes differ wildly. For instance, the Codex calls for an entire company to be devoted to the role of a close support reserve company, a doctrine entirely incompatible with the Willbreakers' methods of war. The Willbreakers, among other things, have changed the traditional role of a company champion from a bodyguard of the captain of their company to an advisor and second-in-command. As the chapter sacrifices its close-range abilities in favor of heavy weapons, it is possible, though very uncommon, for the Astartes who has not served in the first company to be given the honor of wearing the Terminator plate. Veteran squads are not rigidly assigned to the first company either. Some companies have squads of veterans who have never served in the first, but have accumulated enough experience to be more than on par with the first company's brothers. When transitioning from the 10th company, a Marine is given a choice of role that he wishes to be assigned to, unlike Codex-compliant chapters, which assign their recruits to devastator squads. The gene seed of the Willbreakers has been slightly affected by the desert environment of Dusthaven, in much the same way that the Salamanders have been affected by their homeworld of Nocturne. The skin of this chapter's Marines is a darker hue than the Ultramarine or Blood Angels' counterparts. Their eyes also have a faint yellow glow. Some have postulated that the Willbreakers are descended from the Salamanders due to this gene seed variation, but every aspect of their history indicates Ultramarine succession. Their veins are also slightly discolored, with a hint of red visible in all of the outer veins, where they would usually appear green or purple. The Willbreakers do not treat their serfs with the same aloofness or even disdain as other Astartes. Any from the world of Dusthaven are invited to travel to the fortress monastery to give themselves to the service of the Willbreakers, where a purpose will be found for them, either on or off Dusthaven. Chapter serfs are treated well, given decent meals and quarters, and invited to join the Willbreakers for meals in their downtime. This attitude stems from the fact that the Willbreakers see their serfs as just as much a part of their chapter as any battle brother, for they know that without the civilian elements, the chapter would be a garrison force for Dusthaven at best. Chapter artificers are treated almost with reverence for their skill, are repairing and creating the weapons of the chapter. Even if one has no particular skill, more logistical deck officers are never refused, and it takes the barest fraction of intelligence to carry crates across the hangar. The Willbreakers strictly forbid any serfs to be present in any active war zones, as they would likely fall prey to the same merciless tactics as civilians often experience when the chapter decides on its course of action. The chapter world of the Willbreakers is a mostly desert planet known as Dusthaven. Most of the planet is covered in dry, arid desert that in places is so dry that no life exists even on the microbiological level. Around the equator, however, a dense jungle springs up that rings the entire planet. While the desert flats are practically lifeless, this jungle is teeming with predators, reptilian, avian and insectile. To travel through the jungle is to invite death from 1,000 equally agonizing ways. Nearly every animal, from the humble blackheart spider to the gigantic razor-toothed lion, is perfectly evolved to maim, poison and kill every other breathing thing in the hellish mass of creepers and trees. The blackheart spider is named for the first time it was encountered on Dusthaven. A single colonist had left a settlement for the jungle and returned a day later, barely alive, a small black spider clinging to his neck by the teeth. Subsequent autopsy revealed that the entire circulatory system had been turned jet black by the spider's potent venom. Further examination revealed that the blood itself had been turned poisonous and corrosive. It was theorized that the spider bit a victim and left it to die. When it was consumed by a carrion-eating animal, the blood would kill the larger creature, providing a large meal for the spider. A few herbivores picked their way through the jungle, but the mostly poisonous flora provides very little edible food. Life for these animals is often short, painful and terrifying as they desperately try to evade the hellish predators that make up most of the life in the jungle. Even for those animals that are equipped to hunt the other denizens of the jungle, life is filled with conflict and often ends in pain. As the saying goes, there is always a bigger fish. Even the plants in this jungle are inhospitable. The most feared is the death bell, an exotic-looking plant that stands around a meter tall. When the long hairs that extend from its stem feel something brush them, the plant releases a cocktail of airborne pheromones powerful enough to entice small creatures into the large, bulb-like flower. When the hairs inside the flower are brushed, the stem shoots a spurt of venom up into the unfortunate creature's face. Vines then unfurl from the stem and drag the body further into the plant, where it is consumed by the powerful acids that are held within the plant's deceptively bright bulb. The resulting nourishment feeds the plant and allows it to release seeds into the wind that, with fortune or perhaps misfortune, will land in clear earth and grow into new death bells. Human cities dot the planet's surface, sustained by deep underground springs and massive hydroponics complexes. These cities primarily work to manufacture the more advanced technologies of the Imperium, taking the resources from nearby mining worlds and pumping out advanced sensor gear and exotic weaponry. The civilian planet is organized under a system of elected dictatorship, whereby a single leader is elected to become absolute ruler, and another election is only held when that leader passes away. The people of Dusthaven lead tough and testing lives, but they are usually much better than the ones faced by people living in hive or dead worlds. The atmosphere, while not entirely hospitable, is not nearly as polluted or toxic as world like Necromunda, and the PDF does a passable job of keeping the larger desert predators away from the metropolis. That is not to say that the people of Dusthaven lead easy lives. The environment of Dusthaven is scorching, and if the environmental controls in the manufactorums fail, the factories become death traps of hellish heat. If any civilian wanders out into the desert and becomes lost, or foolishly enters the equatorial jungle, their chances of survival are tiny. There is no death penalty on Dusthaven. Instead, the highest punishment is to be taken into the jungle via aerial transport and be left behind. If the criminal makes it back to the city they were taken from, they will have served their punishment. Named for its staple planet, the Dusthaven system contains 5 planets aside from Dusthaven itself. Tarotia, a venerable fortress world that lies the closest to the system's sun. Nearly the entire world is covered in massive military installations, practically bristling with weapons emplacements. The agri-world of Harossery is second closest to the sun. The surface itself is relatively sparsely populated, but beneath the planet's crust, huge underground complexes of hydroponics and living quarters that can produce millions of tons of food in a Terran year. These underground cities are poorly defended, but the world has its own Imperial Guard regiments, known for skills in aerial combat tactics. Thirdly, the high world of Jetras sits in a similar orbit to Dusthaven itself. The industrial world of Respalia provide the other planets with weapons, machines, and all other kinds of technology. Finally, the death world of Morsheath is used as a suitable training ground for the regiments of the world. Occasional Willbreakers excursions travel to the world for special training. Each one of these worlds raised their own Imperial Guard regiments, as is required by the Administratum. The fortress monastery of Gladius Invictus sits in the middle of a great and arid desert. A mountain protrudes from the ground, and into this mountain is built the fortress monastery of the Willbreakers chapter. Most of the monastery extends into the ground to protect it from the harsh desert storms, but a single Gothic tower protrudes from the side of the mountain, imposing and completely covered in weapons emplacements. In the highly unlikely event that an invading force will make it past the 9th Company fleet, which is almost permanently stationed in orbit, the various orbital defense satellites, and ground-to-orbit missiles, the Planetary Defense Force, a hardy group of relatively well-trained and armed militia, the Dusthaven Militarum regiments, specialists in desert warfare, and the Neophyte squads and Landspeeder storm squadrons that patrol the desert, they will find themselves facing down hundreds of pintle-mounted bolters, plasma turrets, and missile emplacements. These weapons are mounted on a building with 5-meter-thick ceramite walls and nigh impenetrable doors. Inside the monastery is a winding network of tunnels, halls, and chambers equipped for all purposes. The labyrinth is divided into sections based on functions: apothecarium, armory, etc. And each neophyte is required to learn entirely the layout of the monastery as a part of their trials. Above the door is mounted a golden strip of metal inscribed "Mankind lives forever." In times of siege, the monastery can contact the PDF and Dusthaven regiments for support, or when very desperate, the monastery's astropathic choir is equipped to contact any willing Willbreakers fleet that were not present at the planet when it fell under attack. If the monastery appears to be on the brink of falling and no help is on the way, then the Willbreakers will fight to take as many of the enemy, whomever that might be, with them before the monastery falls, at which point a self-destruct device will be activated with a range of 50 miles, enough to tear the heart out of any foes and engrave the chapter's final legacy on the skin of their murderers. Each company of the chapter, save the 10th, are given command of a fleet of warships, ranging from 5 to 15 ships, depending on the company that wields them. Some of the fleets are adapted and used for a specific purpose. The 9th Company fleet is almost perpetually kept in orbit of Dusthaven, while the 6th contains a disproportionate amount of drop-pod launch ships and orbital transports. Each of the fleets have a flagship that is the personal vessel of the company commander and whatever retinue he has seen fit to elect for his command squad. In addition to the 9 company fleets, the Willbreakers maintain a reserve pool of vessels that do not belong to any specific fleet, but can be used to reinforce any damaged fleets, or, if the time is dire, be deployed as a separate fleet. The chapter master also has a small personal fleet made up of ships whose captains and crews have proven themselves worthy of defending the most senior members of the chapter. This includes Terrifon's ironclad-class battle barge, Reaper's Arrow. The overall fleet contains far more heavy ships than most other chapter fleets. In addition to the 10 fleets, each specialty of the chapter has its own small fleet and a flagship which is given over to the head of the division. Librus Hawks commands the largest of these flagships in the smaller division under the flag of the fleet Librari. The Tech Marines command the smallest fleet, the barest few frigates to their name, but their presence is always a boon, as their crews can repair other ships with far more speed and efficiency than the crews compromised of serfs. Any large ships operating alone will commonly be escorted by a cohort of 3 to 4 Nova-class frigates to provide anti-capital firepower. These ships, Lance Flame, Errata Imperati, Purge Herald, and Stiletto, make up a squadron of ships in the Willbreakers fleet dedicated to capital ship protection. Currently, the chapter maintains 3 battle barges: Reaper's Arrow, Ironclad class, Amadeus, Legate class, and Traitor's Dread, Warpspite class. The chapter has a slightly larger fleet than most because they have an agreement with the shipyards of Respalia, whereby a small portion of the world's ship production will be devoted to producing ships for the Willbreakers. A significant portion of the Willbreakers' fleet was constructed at the nearby Port Forgehead, the largest shipbuilding facility in the sector. Both the Amadeus and Reaper's Arrow were built there by the venerable adepts of Forgeheart. The chapter has deep ties to the people and governance of Dusthaven. The citizens revere the Space Marines as protectors of their world. In turn, the Space Marines care for the people of the planet. Despite not being an official member of the planet's rulership, the chapter master has great influence within the bureaucracy. Any suggestions or requests he makes are likely to be listened to and obliged. The Gladius Invictus and the surrounding area are under the control of the chapter and are subject to its laws.